I want to start with saying namaste to all of you, because that's what Gloria told me when I first met her, and I was so thrilled that she knew how to say my name, and she also knew the word namaste, because this was somewhere in the mid-'80s where people would just look at my name and go, what, so I want to start with that. And I just want to say that in the pre-internet era, when I lived in India, we got to know all the icons through paper. So you were a picture on the paper. And I was really thrilled to meet you for the first time in Portland. But that was like I was one amongst some 1,000 or 1,500 people who saw you on the stage. And I always thought, when I read about you, read about all the accomplishments, I thought I would always meet this woman who's like this towering presence with this, thundering voice, all this stuff. And then, lo and behold, imagine my surprise, I was working right across the street when actually Gloria and David and the dog, you all walked in, and with this wide grin on her face and this slender frame, and this is the first time I got to see her like live in front of me, and I said, wow, she's just so different and so wonderful. And we had a great chat, and of course I'm no fool that her slender frame doesn't hide the strength she has behind. And I've been really privileged to actually today sit across from you and ask you a few questions today. And the idea is I wanted to talk about your future, present, and past in that order.
Just a little thing like that.
Just a little thing like that. All in 10 minutes. No, not quite. So I think, it's amazing. You've done so many different things, and you have had such an incredible journey. I think even I've been following you for many years. I didn't know all the things you have done really till I started researching you. So I first want to start about what's occupying your mind today. Right now, what are the things that keep you excited?
That's the hardest question in a way, isn't it? It's easier to answer about the past. Well, I'm continuing to be an organizer, which is the way I think of it, to travel around the country, to speak, to do fundraisers, it's really like being an organizer. I keep hoping I'll do it less, so I'll write more, because I think that I will otherwise be on my deathbed saying, but
That's not what I meant.
And in terms of immediate issues, which is relevant to why we're here, the whole area of sex and labor trafficking, which of course knows no boundaries and goes on in this country as well as in most other countries, is very primary. For instance, we just succeeded after 3 years of effort in getting the first law against human trafficking in New York State. There's federal legislation, but there needs to be legislation in every state, because otherwise the police don't really know what to do. They sort of treat trafficked women and children as if the women were free will prostitutes and they put them in jail, or the kids, they don't get the services they need. So it's a very, very good piece of legislation. And a very similar piece of legislation is just passed in Nepal as well. Mm-hmm. And I know this is an issue in India because there is upcoming legislation now. Perhaps we should talk about that. It's very...
Yeah.
So, that's a very important area, to put it mildly. And then in a more general way, about a year ago, we started the Women's Media Center, which is a concentration of women who are media professionals of all different backgrounds, who probably wouldn't have been in the media in their same positions in the media, say 10 or 20 years ago. So this is like a second or third generation organization. And by coming together to make a critical mass, we hope we can have some impact on getting better information into the media. So, and we have offices in New York and the Empire State Building. If you come to New York and you need a place to have to work or to have a press conference or something, we have fairly big offices, donated, of course, there. And you can go to the Women's Media Center website. It's a good place to go with your coffee or tea in the morning, and there are stories there. So there are those kinds of things going on all the time. And then there's the whole task of getting rid of Bush and everyone associated with President Bush.
Well, then you can't do anything else.
Yeah, no. Well, anyway, right. I always feel, especially because I just spent the month of February in India, I felt I had to personally apologize to everybody for inflicting him on the world. Yeah. So there's no shortage of things to be obsessed with.
Actually, continuing on that about politics, you said that change does not start in the electoral system, it starts in the streets. So tell us a little bit about what changes you would like to see, and just to put you on the spot, who would you want in the White House?
Mm-hmm. Well, we've seen such huge changes in the other direction, in these Bush years, and to a large extent in the Reagan years too, and beginning in the they've really been selling off the government one function at a time. Private companies are running prisons. That's where the guards who were in Abu Ghraib came from private prisons. You can't make profit in prisons and run prisons decently, really. Selling off schools. We'll get rid of them in time, talking about privatizing water. They kept saying water is the oil of the 21st century. Yeah. So all of the process of reversing all of these things is enormous, not to mention trying to solve the disaster. Hard to imagine a bigger disaster than Iraq it has become. Yeah. I don't want to go on with that kind of list because I think we all know that already, But there are some new efforts that I think are of interest to all of us. For instance, I think it would be quite possible to, we've worked for equal pay. We don't have it yet, of course, but we're moving towards it. We've worked for comparable worth. And another legislative effort will be to attribute an economic value to all caregiving, which is about 30% of the work that's done in the country, whether done by men or women. Obviously it's 90% done by women, but if it's done by men, great, all the better. And to attribute an economic value at replacement level and make that tax deductible if we pay taxes, and tax refundable if we're too poor to pay taxes. So it would substitute for welfare. And so there are new, even though we're still fighting to get back what we've lost, there are ways in which we can move forward.
Yeah, I thought that was so interesting, that whole argument, and there's a book written about it, etc., about putting an economic value to a woman staying home and taking care of everything at home, and to put a value to it.
But not necessarily staying home. Suppose she or he is caring for elderly parents or invalid, or caregiving here, is a huge percentage, and in agricultural or other less industrialized countries, it's a bigger percentage. And there's a book by Marilyn Waring called "If Women Counted," which is can give you the philosophy of this. But it's a form of women who don't work. Homemakers work harder than any class of worker in any country, for more hours, with less pay, and more likelihood of being replaced by a younger worker.
Yeah. One of the things I've always been curious, I was born in the 60s and, came here. And I always wondered why the words feminism and femininity are seen as mutually exclusive. One look at you just should tell that they're not. But I always wonder, what's your take on, do you think that's changing, or do you think the younger generation is embracing feminist, or they don't need to care about it anymore because it's been done? Tell me your thoughts on why is the term seen as such a mutually exclusive term?
Well, or why is feminism not seen as a controversial term?
Right. I'm saying, why is the word feminism and femininity, why are they seen as two separate things?
Well, because they are different, actually. In that case, I think people either once they know what feminism is, which is the belief in the full social, political equality of males and females, it's different. And although some people are still against it, but most people are for it. But and there are other words that mean the same thing: womanism, women's liberation. I always wish I was a Spanish-speaking person so I could say mujerista, which is it sounds great. But femininity and masculinity, I would say, this is my personal answer, doesn't exist. There's humanity. And there's a full circle of human qualities in all of us, uniquely combined in each of us. Though I have been trained by my culture to be a female impersonator, we'll get to be more fully human as time goes on, so because men are just as loving and nurturing as women. It's a kind of libel, a terrible thing to say about men, to say that's not true. And women are just as daring or assertive or whatever it is that is not thought to be feminine.
But it is true that in just the word feminist, when you say it, somehow it seemed, people feel that you're somehow aggressive, you're not, my pet peeve always is that if a man is strong, they say, look what a strong man he is. If a woman is strong, they say, oh, she's such a bitch. I mean, it's just, and there seemed to be this terminology called feminism that people say, oh, but, I believe in equal rights, but I'm not really a feminist, So what's your take on?
Well, some of it is manufactured, because we do have Rush Limbaugh talking about feminazi and distorting in the same way that liberal is distorted or affirmative action is distorted. So some of it is the demonization of the word, and some of it is that we profoundly, deeply think that the normal male-female relationships, not all of us, but lots of us have been raised in this culture, so that the normal relationship is 60-40 or 70-30, so 50-50 feels threatening. It's only 50-50, but it can feel threatening because masculinity has been culturally defined as superior to women, dominating, controlling, victorious, even violent. Through no fault of the men who got born into this, they got stuck with it too, and it's shortening their lives. And so, but that's the kind of air we breathe every day. So just to talk about equality is taking away dominance, and it can be quite threatening.
Yeah. So continuing, actually now I want to turn the attention a little bit to you. Your career started in journalism, and you wrote the first article in Esquire about the contraceptive pill and the social impact. But obviously you're most known for your Playboy Bunny article, where you researched being a Playboy Bunny, and you said it was a career setback for you doing that article. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was. I mean, since then I've come to peace with it. But for many years afterwards, I was very sorry I did it because it was hard enough to be taken seriously as a female journalist. But it was even more difficult if people kept introducing you as an ex-bunny. Yeah. And so I would say to myself, okay, do I explain, that I did this under another name as an investigative journalism piece and got sued, and but I didn't like to do that either, because when I did that, I felt I was deserting the women who were bunnies, right. Because they were just trying to support their kids. It was a terrible job. They got paid very poorly. I certainly felt I had more in common with them than I did with the male editors who sent me there, who thought it was a joke, and it wasn't a joke. I mean, it was terrible working conditions. So I never quite solved it.
Yeah, but you accepted it now.
Yeah, well, I finally decided that it was a good thing to do because they're working women like any other working women, and I was exposing those working conditions. But for a long time, I was sorry I did it.
Okay. And, the Silicon Valley people know this, and you said earlier you're a serial entrepreneur. And when you tried to start Miss Magazine, you found it very difficult to raise the funding. And there was a very interesting deal you did with New York Magazine that actually launched Miss Magazine. So tell us a little bit of the story of how Miss Magazine was a dramatic launch, actually.
Well, I had helped to start, I've been one of the writers who helped to start New York Magazine, which was kind of the first of the big city magazines. We wanted to start Ms. Magazine just to actually, have a women's magazine that was not, that we read and that had, we couldn't raise money for it. And Clay Felker, wonderful, one of the great editors of all time, said that he would pay for a sample issue if a portion of that issue, was available for his year-end issue. So it's an interesting way, if any of you were trying to start a publication, although, now it's more on the internet, but still, it's an interesting way of starting a publication, because if you can put it inside, something that has a part of the same audience that you want, it's a way of giving birth to a new publication.
Yeah, and you put it as an insert, and there's a funny story of how you came to San Francisco, and they said, "Oh, we can't find the magazine," and you called. She called the editor and said, "There's a big problem. The magazines haven't arrived." What she didn't realize is that they were all sold out. So it was such a huge, and they had to. And since then, you launched the Miss
No,
magazine.
it was definitely here in San Francisco that I realized that, because it was the first issue we put on the came out in January, and we called it Spring. because we were afraid that it would just lie there, on the newsstands and, embarrass the movement or something. But it sold out in 8 days, and it was here in San Francisco that I realized that.
Yeah. And now I want to talk a little bit about your childhood and about some amazing influences you've had from that. You write about your father was an antique dealer, proud to wear no hat and have no job. And your mother was actually once a managing editor, but most of your adult life you took care of her because she was mentally ill. And actually, when I was reading about that, I could relate most to you, because my grandmother became mentally ill because she had diabetes. And it's such a difficult thing to live with that. And I just want to read a beautiful quote you had in your article. She was just a fact of life when I was growing up. Someone to be worried about and cared for, an invalid who lay in bed with eyes closed and lips moving in occasional response to voices only she could hear. And you wrote the rest of the article it's a very touching article you have. So tell us a little bit about your mother, father, your life in East Toledo. What influences they both had? It's very interesting what they taught you to do and not do in life. So,
well, actually, my mother and both of my grandmothers are in some way responsible for my attraction to India and going to live in India for 2 years after I first graduated from college, because they were theosophists. Theosophy is still, you still see theosophical lodges, but of course it's not the vital movement that it was in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Krishna Menon, I think, was a theosophist in the beginning.
Society,
So
my father used to talk about it a lot. Annie Besant,
Yes, Annie Besant, right. Yes, there were a lot of the early suffragists who became theosophists, and I always thought it was because they experienced injustice at such a deep level. And Annie Besant's daughter was taken away from her because she was a suffragist, that the only rough justice they could imagine was reincarnation. This man is going to be reborn as a woman.
No, that would be lucky. He'll be one of the rat.
So anyway, I'm sure I absorbed a certain amount, because my mother used to take me to Theosophical Lodge meetings, and I would be there with my coloring book, at age 4 or 5 or something. Lotus Leaves for the Young, I remember, was the title of it. And I'm sure that was the beginning of a kind of magnetism I had for India. But my parents were loving, wonderful people. I never was hit or ever treated as anything less than a person with a will of my own, and I'm very, very grateful for that. They were not necessarily responsible or competent, but they couldn't help that. I think all kids want is that is to be treated as well as the parents treat themselves.
Right.
And that was always clear to me, that they treated me as well or better as they treated themselves.
Yeah.
So I could never find it in my heart to be angry. I mean, there were some hard times, but they were doing the best they could.
And you actually say that your choice to be a freelance writer was a lot because of your father.
Yes, because my father really, how can I explain? He had a summer resort in the summertime and the wintertime. He was putting us in a house trailer, and we were wandering around selling antiques and going from Michigan to Florida or California. And so it was a very insecure life. And he never wanted to know what was going to happen tomorrow, because if he didn't know, it might be wonderful. and I think that helped me to become a freelance writer, because you do have to be willing to live with insecurity. And since I'd never actually known intimately people who actually had a regular income, it was helpful in the long run. Although at the time you don't know that, So at the time I wasn't going to school, for instance, till I was about 12, and I kept wanting to go to school like the other kids. But now I realized I missed a lot of brainwashing.
Thank God.
Because nobody was telling me girls do this, boys do that.
But you did go to Smith College, where they did sort of tell you what the girls were supposed to do, and still survived it.
Yeah, yes, it was the 50s at Smith, so it was a girls' school, not yet a women's college, which it is now. It's quite different. I just came from there. It's wonderful. It's a completely different place. But the 1950s, there's some folks here who remember that, the 1950s, in this country especially, were extremely conservative, because it was after World War II. They were trying to get women out of the paid labor force where they had been during the war, back into the suburbs, any place. It was very, very conservative.
Yeah. I mean, it's not that different. I mean, I went to school in the 80s, and still they used to joke that there's a bunch of people who are going to get the MRS degree. So it's still there. So to continue on the India trip, and you're actually going to India was also pretty dramatic. You got a scholarship and you went there for 2 years. And you actually did a documentary in which you talked about the abortion you had in London before you went to India. I'm interested to know, in what stage did you go to India? Did India heal you, receive you? Because it's pretty dramatic, what you went through before you went to India. So tell me a little bit about, how was it at first when you went? What was your first impression of India?
Well, I have to say that part of the reason I went was that I was engaged in trying not to get married. Okay, so I mean,
actually, your professor was very glad you broke the engagement to go to India.
But because part of it was that I was drawn to India for other reasons. Yes, and part of it was that I had a wonderful professor at Smith named Vera Michaels-Dean. I don't know if anybody remembers her, but she did a wonderful course about India, and I'm very grateful to her. And part of it was that I was trying not to get married, and this was a very magnetic, terrific man, and I knew that if I didn't go very far away, I had a very difficult time getting a visa, because this was a new fellowship, to put it mildly. Nobody had ever heard of it, and understandably, the government had never heard. So I ended up working as a waitress in London for quite a long time. While I was waiting for my visa.
Yeah.
But when I arrived in India, I remember arriving in what was Bombay, not Mumbai, and is it still called the Dum Dum Airport? No,
I don't think so. That's Calcutta.
Dum Dum is Calcutta. See how quick. I mean, this was 50 years ago, so I don't.
Bombay was the Santa Cruz.
Was it Santa Cruz Airport?
Yeah.
All right.
Maybe you went to Calcutta, actually.
No, it was. I've just transposed it in my mind, but it was Bombay, and it just, I just remember it as sensorily overwhelming. It was warm, and it was night, and the tarmac was gleaming, and there was just the incredible fragments of jasmine, and of course people were selling jasmine things, to put in your hair, and it was an infinitely smaller airport at the time. And I had no idea what I was doing. Unfortunately, there was some TWA employee who took pity on me and, and gave me a place to live, with his family for overnight or something. And it was just it's sensory, I think. But the strangest thing was I was supposed to be writing a fellowship report back once a month because it was a kind of early Peace Corps community, which wasn't invented yet, but you were supposed to be a community ambassador and write home to your community. And very soon, within a few weeks, I kind of lost my ability to do that because you have to be a bit of an outside, to do that. And for some reason, I felt instantly at home. And later on, I remember somebody who did my horoscope told me that I had been a Bengali in a previous life and had done something terrible to be born in the United States.
And you just came home. See, that's why you keep saying dum-dum. Yeah.
And then I lived but fairly soon I went to Delhi, and I was living in Miranda House for a while.
And then did you spend most of the time in Delhi when you were there? Did you travel around?
No, then after that, a few months there, then I began to travel around. At first I went to Missouri because I fell in with a group of people named the Radical Humanists. Does anybody remember the Radical Humanists? M.N. Roy, who was head of the Communist Party in India during...
See, you were a Bengali.
Much earlier, but during World War II, I believe. And then when the Communist Party, this was a great education to me about communism because I think I'd arrived with much more of a romance about communism because Joseph McCarthy was here, and there's nothing like Joseph McCarthy and his campaigns to make you feel sympathetic to being a communist too. But the Communist Party of India had then been ordered by the Soviet Communist Party to support the British and go against the independence movement. So because of that, they had withdrawn and become the Radical Humanists.
Okay.
And they're a wonderful group of people who I then would go from city to city, hanging out with the Radical Humanists. Really good, nice, very good people.
And did you actually write about all this?
A little bit, yeah. Not at the, yeah.
And you actually, when you left, you wrote a guidebook about Americans coming to India called 1,000 Indias. So tell me a little bit about that. Is it still available?
That was after, after I had been there about a year and a half or so, and I didn't have money to go home. So I was trying to figure out how to do this. And so Air India was looking for a way to encourage tourists to stay longer in India rather than just going Delhi, Agra, Jaipur, making this triangular tour.
Golden Triangle.
Yeah. So they employed me to write a guidebook. I'm not sure they ever published it as a whole guidebook. I think it was published as pieces, but nonetheless, it was very generous of them to do this, and it did allow me. It paid, I think, $1,000 or something, which was enough to get home.
Yeah.
Right.
And actually, when you came here and started your writing career, you say that you really wanted to write about India, but you were very frustrated because nobody was interested. That in some strange way started your journalistic career. So tell us a little bit about what is it did you want to really write about? And
well, I don't know how to say this without sounding really naive, but then I was, of course, really naive. But I felt transformed by those 2 years, and I felt urgent, also about trying to say, now this, even the Beatles hadn't gone to India yet, right? So, I'm sorry to say that here in 1958, 59, if you talked about India, people sort of, their
eyes rolled over.
Yes, right. Right. So I really wanted to find some place where I could write about it, but or be connected to it in some way, but I couldn't.
Yeah, and And you've gone back since then to India many
yes,
times.
only twice, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah. So how long after how many years did you go back to India?
Well, I went back in the 70s, and then I just went back for the month of February. Okay. And it's, somehow in between those times, the social justice movements here and the women's movement, and so I mean things. I just kept thinking, yes, I'm definitely going, but right now I have to, I got to be much too long. But fortunately, the friends there with whom I'm very connected, kind of family members, were often coming and staying with me, and so the folks here know Devaki Jain or Lakshmi Jain, or I don't know. Anyway, there were a lot of people who allowed me to keep in touch. And in a way, the rebirth of the women's movement in India and here happened fairly simultaneously. So we were kind of finishing each other's sentences.
Yeah. And you actually said that when you came back from India and you felt that the women there it's not that they were dormant in some way, they were much more powerful than the high-class women that were here. So how do you see it now? I mean, just expand a little bit on what you talked about, the women here and in India and the women of Indian origin who are here. In what way have they transformed in the last 20 years between your trips?
Well, I don't feel that I can speak for, I mean, it's so diverse, so enormously diverse. Mm-hmm. But certainly, earlier on in India, there's such a value on education that if a woman was a physician or was an engineer or was, then she was able to be a professional in a way that wasn't true here, even proportionately. I mean, there was a bigger percentage of women physicians and probably a bigger percentage, maybe not of women in government, I'm not sure, but in the professions in general. Some of it, I suppose, was because of the power of families, in a sense, because I suppose that if Indira Gandhi had had a brother, it would have been very different. Right. It was the power of the family in that case. Yeah. But it was certainly very instructive to me. And when I went back the second time, which would have been 30 years ago, and my friend Devaki and I were, we decided we were going to write a book of Gandhian tactics for women's movements around the world, because obviously they are well suited to women's movements. And we spent a long time going around India interviewing people and collecting his letters, since so much of what he wrote was in letters. And we finally came to have tea with Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, and she listened to us very patiently, this plan of ours, because she, of course, had worked with Gandhi. And when we were finished, she said, "Well, my dear, we taught him everything he knew." And she explained to us that his tactics had been that the independence movement had subsumed the women's movement and adopted the tactics that the women's movement, which was huge, was using to fight sati and for all kinds of reasons. Yeah. And it just made me laugh. I thought, you see, our history gets lost. Yes, wherever we are. Yeah.
And in your interactions with India, now I want to turn to the organization Prajwala, which works on victims of trafficking. I actually went to Hyderabad last year, and I spent a day with them. And it was quite amazing to me in the midst of Hyderabad, a place I grew up. I didn't even know there was such a big issue. And I went to the home they created. And I was just very shocked to find out that the age of the child in trafficking is getting lower and lower and lower. And actually, the men believe that if you have a 4 or a 5 or a 6-year-old girl, it somehow stops you from getting AIDS or whatever, all this
or it even
stuff.
Cures you.
Cures you. So she said it's very difficult, and then the fights they have to get them out of that. etc. And they create an amazing safe house. And what they also do is to get the women back into the profession. So I went to the workshop where they were creating notebooks. Basically, they got orders from all the schools, and they create these notebooks for the schools and provide the notebooks. And they have a place where they create like benches and chairs, and it's very strong women. So but the amount of effort they have to go through to just keep these women was just mind-boggling to me. So tell me, how did you first meet Sunita? How did you come to know about this organization?
Well, a dear friend named Perdita Houston, who was, as much as any single person can be, the person who began to look at development, economic development, as if women mattered. That was the title of her first book. She died of cancer in an untimely way, and her family, her children, created an award in her name. And so we, every year, look at many, many different women who are, doing amazing things. And Sunita won the award. It must have been 3 years ago. So she came to this country, and that's how we first met. And she and her husband stayed with me, and we came to be friends and did a lot of things together. So when I went there, then I also did just as you did, go to visit that amazing project.
Yeah.
She started out doing creating schools for the children of the prostituted women, because that was what the women wanted her to do first, so their children could, because they weren't accepted in the other schools. And otherwise, they were much more vulnerable to prostitution themselves and to, all kinds of problems. So I don't know, she must have at least a dozen different schools hidden away in little upstairs and, little nooks and crannies. And just to see her with the children, they love her so much, they just love her. And she's a tiny little thing. She's hardly bigger than they are, right?
Yeah.
She's right. And she is their savior and their mother and their playmate, and it's just wonderful, wonderful to see. We also went to the halfway house where women can stay and with their kids and be safe and so on. The children did a dance for us with stars on their, cut out stars and music and all kinds of things. And the youngest child was 3.5. She had been raped by her father, sold by her brother, and there she was. I can't, it's just hard to even, as Sunita says, every day she sees the best and the worst of humanity, because she sees the spirit, that comes in this child smiling and responding, and she sees generosity, but she sees the worst too.
Yeah. What made her, when you did this, contest for this award, what made her stand out among all the other people, or her organization stand out for you?
I think that especially in the area of sex trafficking, what made her stand out was that she was not just, as some organizations are doing, handing out condoms. Now I'm all in favor of harm reduction, but if you're standing there handing out condoms to men, and I would like to say that 25% of the men who patronize prostituted women and children in India come from this country. We can't say that this happens somewhere else. It doesn't happen somewhere else. That she had taken her own experience, which was being raped. She had been, I think, gang raped and blamed for that, and gone through very hard times, and had been a very high achieving young woman before that. So suddenly she saw, how she was treated afterwards, and it transformed her. She took her own experience and used it to help other people, which is, of course, the final stage of healing in any case. But with such dedication and imagination, and not just treating the women and kids as if they were other, but seeing them as her equals and there could happen to anyone, as she well knew, so that she was not just assuming that this was inevitable, that it was the fault of the women, that they were spoiled somehow for life, but that they were human beings who had been terribly treated and just with a chance, and thus she started these businesses that you were talking about, so that women have another way of making a living, and she becomes their family. She was, in fact, when she was here, she was collecting money for their weddings, and their funerals. Because especially with AIDS, the number of people she has who. But she becomes their family, and they become each other's family. It's complete. It's not a social service. It's a it's a complete human transformation.
Yeah, she's actually an Ashoka Fellow too. And the thing that I found very interesting was that she was addressing the whole circle. You get them out, and they're all very angry. So they go through psychological counseling, and they go through, livelihood counseling. And then you train them in accounting and running a business and all that stuff. And you actually stay with them to open that business and get them to be working there. And you find mates for them and get them married, or bury them, and whatever it is, So from where she raises them, she just put an ecosystem so that everything is included in it.
And this was very controversial in the beginning, because what she did was to send men who were with Prajwala into the brothels with cameras, so that she could demonstrate that there were people there against women against their will, underage kids, all of that. This in the beginning, the sex industry people said this was against their human rights, that these women had, a right to do this. And so, it was extremely controversial in the beginning, and not anymore. And she also trained the police. So it has become best practices, and it started out as incredibly controversial, but she stuck with it.
And finally, she's doing a lot of work in passing the bills and the whole government side of things also. So it is pretty amazing that such a small organization has, had huge impact at every level. And so, they're very lucky to have a champion like you. And actually, she was very open to coming here and addressing everybody the moment Sunita introduced us for the third time, I think. I've met her about twice before. So now turning back again, to wrap up, to talk a little bit about you. There are two questions I have to ask about you. One is, when you got married, the press exploded, and you got married to a wonderful man. I had the opportunity to meet David. What made you get married at age 66?
The INS. He was born in South Africa, and he had a British passport. We loved each other. We would have lived together. But at 60, he was 59, I was 66. We're not going to have children. And I thought, after all, the women's movement has spent 30 years equalizing the marriage laws. I'm not sure I could have done it if it was as bad, the marriage laws here were as bad as they used to be, because you gave up your civil rights, you gave up your name, your credit rating, your legal domicile, all your civil rights. But we've spent 30 years changing the laws and equalizing the laws. So I thought, well, why not? Why not? And we had a wonderful ceremony in Cherokee. Because we were going to the Cherokee reunion. Wilma Mankiller, or her husband, did this ceremony in Cherokee, and it turned out to be a great blessing, because he, when later on became ill, he could be covered by my insurance. Otherwise, he would not have been, and he was ill for a whole year. It would have really broken his grown-up children and me and everyone else if he hadn't been covered. And though I had been up until that time advocating for same-sex marriage, I didn't understand how important it was, actually, until then. I came to understand much more deeply how important it was.
Yeah. And then I have to ask you the next question of how is it to be the stepmom to a Hollywood hottie and an incredibly talented actor called the Batman Christian Bale?
Yes, he's a wonderful actor. He is such a good actor. Have you seen?
Very talented.
Yeah,
The Machinist.
The Machinist, and well, the 3 Ten to Yuma is the current one, but also Rescue Dawn, and just it's a wonderfully talented actor. Well, it's not what we might think, because he's extremely private and shy. Not shy exactly, but he doesn't like to do interviews. He does. I mean, he lives a completely un-Hollywood life.
Yeah.
So it might not be the same. But he has sisters, 2 wonderful sisters, and we continue to be friends and close, and it's a great gift, to have them in my life. Right? And they're actually a lot more interesting than some of my relatives.
Actually, if you do an internet search, it says Gloria Steinem worried about her son losing weight and gaining so quickly between 2 movies.
Well, it was. I don't know if anyone here saw The Machinist, but he lost 65 pounds in order, because when he's in a part, he's in it, and he really endangered his health in order to portray this.
Yeah. Another thing, continuing on we talked a little bit about the healthcare, about insurance, etc. You yourself are a survivor of breast cancer. And, when I was reading your background, it's just amazing how many things I could recognize. You had trigeminal neuralgia. Mm-hmm. My father had it.
Oh,
so
really? Oh.
I used to, it was so difficult to watch it. It's not like it's cancer, but it's really debilitating too.
You don't die, but you think you'd like to.
Yes, yeah. Right. It's just so, and watching it's so difficult because you can't do anything. And I remember that, that face, the jaw. I just remember it so vividly. And how was it for you when your body is not listening to your mind, or how did you deal with it? Mm-hmm. In both cases?
I can't say that I've really faced the kind of test that many people have, because breast cancer turned out to be a very, very minor incidence, of which, the worst thing that happened was that when I was lying on the table to get radiation, I suddenly remembered that I was supposed to be at a fundraising appointment, and the door was closed, and there was no phone, and I could. But that was 20 years ago, and it hasn't. It was. I did not go through what so many women do go through. The trigeminal neuralgia, which, if you don't know, is a kind of terrible pain, like a dentist has touched your nerve with a drill. It's just awful. That's activated by speaking or eating or moving. But I was able just to stay put, just to stay quiet, because I'm more in control of my work life. I could stay home. And so I honestly don't feel that I've faced the kind of test yet that most people do when you think about serious illness.
Yeah. I think only you can say that, but I know what that pain is like. You didn't answer one of my questions.
What?
I said, who do you want to see in the White House?
Oh. Well, I actually think that the range of Democrats we have this time, and I don't want to leave the impression that we should abandon the Republican Party just because it's been taken over by old right-wing Democrats. I always have to, apologize to my Republican friend. And I always think about Lee Grant, the actress Lee Grant, who said to me once, she said, I've been married to one Marxist and one fascist, and neither one took the garbage out. So I think in a way we're talking about something that goes much more deep than party labels.
Yeah.
But for the moment, since the ultra-right wing has taken over the Republican Party, we have to do something about that.
Yeah.
The Democrats this time, I think, are a better crop of folks than I have seen in my lifetime.
Yeah.
I think they're all good people with good hearts and serious intent, and I think it's heartening.
Would you like to campaign for one over the other?
Yes. Well, I wrote a piece for the New York Times because the people or reporters were saying to me, "Are you supporting Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama?" And I would say yes. Because, and the piece I wrote was trying to explain that this is in fact a coalition, and we have to keep it a coalition because if we learn from the days of the abolitionist and suffragist movements when the point was universal adult suffrage, then the vote was given to Negro men, as it was then phrased, first, in order to divide the movement. It did divide the movement. Then some racist white women said, oh, well, we have to make up for the uneducated black vote and so on. And it stopped both movements. I mean, we moved forward as long as it was a coalition and got stopped when it wasn't. So I hope that both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama are able to resist the media pressure to get them to attack each other. There was the whole notion that he had gone to a fundamentalist Islamic school and that her campaign had been the source of this information, and it wasn't. Neither thing was right. He hadn't gone to the school. Her campaign was. There's that effort to drive them apart. It is a coalition. I would be very happy to campaign for him too. I do think that she has so much more experience that. It's the first time we've had the opportunity in this country, to vote for somebody who has had 8 years of on-the-job training.
Yeah.
And no masculinity to prove. And we need those things desperately right now.
Yeah. Great.